still living alone at 33. That's almost embarrassing. My sister didn't mutter that from across the room. She said it clearly, at the dinner table, on Thanksgiving weekend, with 12 family members present, and a 22-pound turkey cooling in the center of the spread. My mother's good china was out. The cranberry sauce had just made its first pass around the table. And my sister had apparently decided that a long weekend was the right time to say something she'd been holding for a while. A few forks paused. My uncle reached for his wine. My mother looked at the tablecloth. I took a slow breath, looked at my sister and said, "Actually, I got married in July." Everything went still. My name is Talia. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a structural engineer at a consulting firm that specializes in public infrastructure. I've spent the last decade designing things that hold weight: bridges, transit stations, overpasses, and I've gotten fairly good at understanding what looks stable from the outside and what's quietly under pressure. My family, I had long since figured out, was the second kind. Growing up, my sister and I occupied very different positions in the house. She was 4 years older, louder, and had a gift for performing happiness, in a way that made our parents feel like they had done something right. When she stumbled, a failed semester, a broken engagement in her late 20s that nobody discussed directly, the narrative shifted quickly. She was going through something. She needed support. People rallied. When I achieved something, a scholarship, a dean's award, my first full-time position straight out of graduate school, the response was usually a variation of, "That's great, honey," followed by a pivot back to whatever my sister was doing that weekend. I stopped expecting fanfare early. What I hadn't anticipated was that the absence of celebration would eventually curdle into something more pointed. Somewhere along the way, my accomplishments stopped being invisible and started being inconvenient. Not to my parents exactly, but to my sister. I noticed it when I bought my first condo, a one-bedroom in Liberty Village that I'd saved for while working brutal hours and living on meal prep for 2 straight years. Instead of congratulations, she asked whether I wasn't worried about carrying a mortgage alone. When I was promoted to senior project lead on a $38 million transit corridor expansion for the city, she told my mother she wasn't sure all those hours were healthy for a woman my age. The message underneath was always the same. I had made the wrong choices, in the wrong order, for the wrong reasons, and someday I'd have to reckon with it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already made the choice that mattered most. And I had made it at a small inn in Prince Edward County on a warm Saturday afternoon in July, with 23 people I trusted around me, while my sister was at a cottage in Muskoka posting photos of her long weekend to 3 platforms simultaneously. I met my husband 2.5 years before that Thanksgiving, during a coordination meeting for a provincial transit project in downtown Toronto. He worked for an architecture firm contracted to the same development, and our teams had overlapping scope on one of the station concourse designs. The first time we spoke at length was during a site walk in February. It was -14, and neither of us was dressed properly for the exposed section of the platform. We stood at the edge of the construction deck, arguing about tolerances and wind load assumptions, both of us wrong about different things. And I remember thinking he was the first person in a work setting who had disagreed with me without being condescending about it. We started meeting for lunch to go over coordination issues. Lunch became coffee, became long Thursday evenings at a bar near Union Station that neither of us had planned to stay long at. He was easy to be with in a way I hadn't experienced before. He listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, didn't talk to fill space. The first time he met my family was at my parents' anniversary dinner the following spring. He was quiet through most of it, but he paid close attention. On the drive back, somewhere on the 401 between Mississauga and the city, he said, "Your sister interrupts you every time you start a sentence." I told him that was just how we were. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "I just want you to know that's not normal." He wasn't trying to open a debate. He just wanted me to have heard it out loud from someone outside the family. I had known it for years, of course. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it named. He never told me to cut anyone off or do anything dramatic. He simply kept reminding me, quietly and consistently, that protecting my own peace wasn't something I owed anyone an apology for. We moved in together after 8 months. He proposed on a camping trip to Killarney, sitting by the lake with no audience and no performance. I said yes so fast he laughed. We planned our wedding the way we'd come to plan most things together, quietly, based entirely on what we actually wanted, with zero input from people who would have turned it into a production. 23 guests. A restored heritage inn in Prince Edward County. Our closest friends, his family, 2 cousins of mine who had always been genuinely kind to me. No obligatory invitations, no long toasts from people performing affection for the crowd. We didn't tell my immediate family. Not to wound them, we made the decision together, carefully, after months of honest conversation. Every time I had brought someone important into the family orbit before, it had become material. My sister had a way of pressing on new things until they bent or broke. I wasn't willing to let her near this one, we agreed. When the time came, it would be on our terms. Neither of us imagined the moment would arrive the way it did. At the Thanksgiving table in Oakville, with the good china out, and the cranberry sauce still circling. The weekend was cool and dry the way October usually is in southern Ontario. My parents' house smelled like roasting garlic and the carpet cleaner my mother had used every year since I was small. I arrived alone because my husband had driven separately. He was picking up a dessert from a bakery in Burlington, and we'd planned to arrive around the same time. I got there a few minutes early. The first hour was manageable. I helped carry dishes, talked to my uncle about his retirement plans, watched my nephew demolish a dinner roll with both hands. My sister arrived with her husband and the kids, and for a while the noise of the children kept everything moving. We sat down to eat. Wine was poured. Someone mentioned the Leafs. My father carved the turkey badly and pretended he hadn't. For a while things held. Then my sister noticed I had come in without a partner. I could see it on her face before she spoke, that particular settling in, like someone getting comfortable before a longer performance. She had an audience, her husband, my parents, 3 aunts and uncles, 2 cousins, and my grandmother, at the far end of the table who was 91 and had heard everything already. My sister poured herself a little more wine, looked over at me, and said in the bright and carefully concerned tone she used when she wanted something to sound like a question, "How's the dating scene treating you these days?" I said it was fine. I kept eating. She pressed further, asked whether I was still putting work first, mentioned that a friend of hers had tried one of the apps and met someone wonderful. A cousin smiled. My mother looked at her plate. My father picked up his knife and fork like he was going to say something, then set them down again. My sister kept going. She mentioned that 33 was still young, in a tone that implied it really wasn't. She said she just didn't want me to look up one day and realize I'd missed the window. She said it with warmth. She always did, because the warmth made it very difficult to object to without sounding fragile. Then she looked around the table to take stock of her audience, settled into her chair, and said it clearly. "Still living alone at 33? That's almost embarrassing." A few people laughed, a few didn't. My grandmother looked up from her plate. I put down my fork, I looked at my sister, and I said calmly without raising my voice at all, "Actually, I got married in July." She stared at me for a moment, and then laughed. Not a genuine laugh, but a dismissive one, the kind meant to signal that someone has said something absurd. "Oh, come on," she said. "You don't have to make things up." My mother said my name quietly. My father looked at me like I had introduced a variable he hadn't prepared for. "If that's true," my uncle said, not unkindly, "where's your husband?" I picked up my phone. I sent one text. I set the phone face down beside my plate and waited. It took less than 4 minutes. The front door opened. He still had a key from the last time we'd stayed over, and my husband walked in carrying a white bakery box and unwinding his scarf one-handed. He stopped in the doorway of the dining room and found my face across the table. Something in his expression settled. "Sorry I'm a bit late," he said. "The QEW was a disaster." He set the bakery box on the sideboard, walked over to where I was sitting, and kissed me on the side of my head. Then he pulled out the empty chair I'd saved and sat down beside me. "I'm Talia's husband," he said to the table. "Happy Thanksgiving." No one spoke for a long moment. My grandmother was the first to make a sound. A short, decisive exhale that could only have meant approval. My sister looked at him, then at me, then at my left hand, which had been resting on the table with my wedding band, clearly visible for the entire dinner, a detail I had not hidden and that no one had noticed. She said, "This doesn't make any sense." My husband glanced at me. I reached into my bag, took out my phone, opened my photos, and slid it to the center of the table. Our wedding photographs. The inn in the background, light coming gold through the trees, both of us laughing at something my best friend had said right before the photographer clicked. Him with his hands on my face, me in a dress I had chosen without committee input for the first time in my adult life. He had also, as it happened, packed a copy of our marriage certificate into his bag that morning. We'd needed it for banking paperwork the week before and he hadn't taken it back out. He set it beside the phone without comment. The silence in the dining room was different now than it had been 4 minutes ago. Relatives leaned in to look at the photos. My cousin said very quietly, "Oh wow." My uncle stood up and reached across the table to shake my husband's hand. My grandmother said something to my sister that I didn't catch completely, but her tone was not ambiguous. My sister crossed her arms. She didn't look at me or at him. My mother asked why we hadn't told anyone. Her voice was steady, but underneath it, I could hear something giving way. I had spent years answering versions of this question, by deflecting or softening, because it was easier than saying the actual thing. I didn't do that this time. I told her I had wanted one day in my life that was mine. One event that didn't require managing anyone else's feelings, preparing for comments, or spending the whole occasion tending to tensions I hadn't created. I told her that every time I had brought something personal into the family, it had been used somehow, and that I had simply chosen not to let that happen with this. The table was very quiet. My husband said, "We didn't do it to leave anyone out, we did it to feel safe." My aunt, my mother's older sister, who had been a quiet presence at the far end of the table all evening, looked up. "I've watched these dinners for a long time," she said carefully. "I understand why you'd want to protect something from them." My sister's head came up. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," my aunt said, without raising her voice, "that this isn't the first time Talia has kept something to herself to avoid being made into the evening's entertainment." The table shifted. My cousin, my mother's sister's daughter, someone I had always been genuinely close to, said she remembered a family dinner years ago when I had received a major promotion at work, and my sister had spent the entire evening questioning whether I was balanced. Someone remembered a birthday where my sister had made a remark about my apartment that had gotten a laugh, but had been unkind if you looked at it without the laugh. One memory opened into another, not loudly, not as a pile-on, more like small things being named for what they had actually been, by people who had been in the room and gone along with it, and now seemed to want to account for themselves. My sister kept insisting they were exaggerating, that she'd only been joking, that everyone was being oversensitive. "It's only a joke," my aunt said, "if everyone's laughing." Across the table, my sister's husband, a quiet man who rarely said much at these gatherings, looked at her for a long moment. He had just sat through 4 different people describe 4 different incidents in 4 different years, none of which she had denied. I could see something shifting in him, some assumption he'd been carrying, that no longer held the same shape. My parents said very little during that part. My father looked at his plate. My mother kept her hands wrapped around her mug. By the time plates started being cleared, the atmosphere in the house had changed so completely, it barely resembled the dinner we had sat down to. The children had drifted to the living room. Conversations were low and careful. My sister had stopped talking entirely. When my husband and I left that evening, I didn't feel the familiar tight-shouldered weight I usually carried out of family events. I felt something I didn't have a clean word for at first. Lighter. A little untethered in a way that turned out to be relief. I didn't send follow-up messages. I hadn't done any of this to win anything. I had answered an honest question honestly, in front of people who had been choosing not to see a pattern for a long time. Whatever they did with that was theirs to work out. The calls started arriving a few days later. My aunt was first. She apologized for years of staying in her chair when she probably should have stood up. She said she'd always been aware of the difference in how I was treated, but had told herself it wasn't her place to say anything. She said she understood now that staying out of it had its own cost. My cousin called the next morning with a similar message. She said she'd laughed at things she shouldn't have, because they had seemed harmless at the time, and she was sorry. My husband was steady through all of it. He didn't make it bigger than it needed to be. He listened when I wanted to talk, stayed quiet when I didn't, and on the evenings when it was a lot to carry, he made dinner and sat beside me without performing anything. My sister never called. I heard through my aunt that she and her husband had been having difficult conversations in the weeks that followed. He had asked her about some of the incidents named at the table, whether they were accurate. She had not answered him well. They were working through it, or attempting to. I didn't ask for details. Someone else's relationship falling under its own weight wasn't something I had been looking for, and I found I didn't feel much about it either way. In January, my firm announced the transit corridor contract publicly. $42 million, DIS, a 2-year build, one of the largest projects in the company's history. My name was in the announcement. My husband made a reservation at a restaurant we'd been meaning to try for months and let me talk about it for as long as I wanted. He had always celebrated things. Not with grand gestures or performances, but in the small consistent ways that accumulate into something that feels like being truly known. He remembered details. He asked about the parts I was worried about. He noticed when I was tired before I said so. He had been doing it since long before we married and showed no signs of stopping. Several months went by before my parents reached out. They asked to come into the city. They would make the drive from Oakville, they said, and I could choose the place. My husband and I talked it over. I agreed to meet them, on my own, at a cafe near our building on a Saturday morning. When I arrived, they were already there. My father had ordered tea. My mother looked like she hadn't been sleeping especially well. My father spoke first. He said they owed me an apology. He said it plainly without preamble, and I was grateful for that. My mother said they had let things go on too long, because they hadn't wanted conflict, that they had told themselves my sister was simply like that, and that I was strong enough to absorb it, and they had never stopped to consider whether either of those framings was fair or true. I listened without interrupting. My father said, "We should have stopped it, we didn't." I told them I forgave them. I meant it. I was no longer carrying the weight of it, not because none of it had happened, but because I had decided some months back that I was finished letting it determine what came next. But I also told them that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing, and that I'd had to learn the difference slowly and on my own. I told them that if they wanted to be part of my life going forward, they were welcome to be. But the terms were different now. I expected to be treated with the same consideration they extended to everyone else in the family. I wasn't going to quietly absorb things in order to preserve a peace that had never actually been peace. My mother's eyes went wet. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "We'll do better," she said. I told her I hoped so. We hugged when we left. It wasn't a resolution, it was the beginning of something that neither of us pretended was further along than it was. I walked back to our building in the November cold and thought that for the first time, I had said the exact true thing to my parents, and no one had tried to soften it before it landed. Whether they would follow through was something only time could answer. I was no longer extending credit in advance. Our first holiday season as a known and acknowledged couple was quiet and extraordinary in equal measure. We hosted at our condo. We'd moved to a 2-bedroom in the Distillery District earlier that year, a place with high ceilings and south-facing windows, and enough room for the kind of evenings we actually wanted to have. We cooked most of the day. We invited the people who had shown up for us without conditions. My cousin and her partner, 2 of his siblings, a small gathering of friends who filled the space with noise that felt easy rather than managed. Nobody had an agenda. Nobody was performing anything for anyone. I stood in the kitchen at one point, looking out at the living room through the pass-through, watching people talk over each other happily, and I felt something I had spent years working toward without being certain it was real. Complete ease. No quiet calculation of who might say what and how I would need to manage it, just the evening as it actually was. My husband came over and handed me a glass of wine. He looked at the room and then back at me. "Good?" he said. "Yeah," I said, "really good." That was all either of us needed to say. People often imagine that the hardest part of a moment like the one at that Thanksgiving table is the moment itself, the silence, the words landing, the room going still. I understand now that the moment was not the hard part. The hard part was everything that came before it. The years of staying composed through small erosions, building a life that felt genuinely real when no one around you was affirming it, learning to trust your own read on what was right after years of being trained to doubt it. What happened at that dinner table was not revenge. I had not planned for my sister to humiliate herself. I had not set a trap or engineered a reveal. I had answered an honest question honestly, in front of people who had been choosing not to pay attention for a long time. The victory was never in her expression when my husband walked through that door, though I would be lying if I claimed that moment didn't mean something. The victory was what had been quietly accumulating before any of it. The marriage we had built entirely on our own terms, the career I had refused to minimize or apologize for, the life that had been moving steadily forward while everyone assumed I was standing still. She had spent years trying to make me feel small enough to need her approval. I had simply been busy making sure I didn't.